Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that felt like an endless loop in my life. My husband, Rob, had left for work before sunrise, a routine that I had come to expect from his demanding job as a construction foreman. Our 8-year-old son, Ethan, was busy playing in the backyard, his laughter the only thing that seemed to break the monotony. I was sipping lukewarm coffee on our porch, feeling like the world was moving while I stood still. That's when I first saw him. Max was hauling furniture from a moving truck next door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his plain white t-shirt clung to his chest in the heat of the morning sun. He looked up, catching me staring, and smiled. A quick, easy grin that made me blush. "Morning," he called out, his voice smooth but friendly. I hesitated for a moment before returning his greeting. "Morning. New to the neighborhood?" He nodded, walking over to the edge of my yard. "Just moved in yesterday. I'm Max." He wiped his hand on his jeans before extending it. "Claire," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his palm warm against mine. Ethan ran up to us then, his curiosity piqued by the newcomer. "Hi, are you moving in there?" he asked, pointing to the house next door. "Sure am," Max replied, crouching to Ethan's level. "I've got a boy about your age. Maybe you two can hang out sometime." Ethan beamed. "Cool," he said before darting back to his game. Max straightened, looking back at me. "It's just me and my son, Jake. Starting fresh, I guess." I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something about him that made me nervous, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't his appearance, though he was undeniably attractive, but the way he seemed so at ease, like he belonged here already. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," I offered, gesturing toward his house. "That's kind of you," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned back toward the moving truck. "Guess I better get back to it. Nice meeting you, Claire." "Nice meeting you too," I said, my voice quieter now. As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing more than the thrill of meeting someone new in our sleepy neighborhood. The next few days passed without much incident. I'd see Max outside occasionally, either unpacking boxes or playing catch with Jake in the yard. He was always friendly, always smiling, and Ethan seemed to adore him. One afternoon, while I was weeding the flower bed by the fence, Max came over again. "You've got a green thumb," he said, leaning casually on the fence. I laughed. "Not really. I'm just trying to keep up appearances." He chuckled, and for a moment, it felt like we were old friends. He mentioned his divorce, how he and Jake had needed a change, and I found myself opening up about my own life. How Rob worked long hours, how I sometimes felt more like a housekeeper than a wife. "I get it," he said, his voice softer now. "It's easy to feel invisible." His words hit harder than I expected. I looked at him, surprised by the understanding in his eyes. From that day on, our conversations became more frequent. They started as innocent exchanges about the weather or the kids, but slowly grew more personal. There was a warmth to Max, a kind of attention I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was harmless. After all, he was just being kind, and I was simply being neighborly. But deep down, a part of me knew that something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. The days passed in a blur of routine, but Max's presence had added a new rhythm to my life. We crossed paths often, sometimes by chance, other times because I found myself lingering outside longer than usual, hoping for an excuse to talk. Ethan and Jake had quickly become inseparable, making it all the more natural for Max and me to interact. But things changed one sunny afternoon when the tension between us became impossible to ignore. It started innocently enough. Ethan had invited Jake over to play video games, leaving Max and me alone in the backyard. I was sitting at the patio table, flipping through a magazine, when Max strolled over, carrying a six-pack of beer. "Thought you could use a break," he said, holding one out to me. I hesitated for a moment before accepting it. "Thanks," I won't say no to that. He sat down across from me, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. You've got a nice setup here, he said, gesturing to the yard. It's peaceful. Peaceful is one way to put it, I replied with a small laugh. It's also isolating sometimes. Max raised an eyebrow. I get that. I felt the same way after my divorce. You go from sharing your life with someone to, well, being alone even when you're not. I looked away, feeling a flicker of discomfort. He had a way of cutting through the surface, of saying things that hit too close to home. Sorry, he said, sensing my unease. I didn't mean to overstep. No, it's fine, I said quickly. It's just complicated. Isn't it always? He replied, leaning back in his chair. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Favorite movies, the quirks of small-town life. But the air between us felt different now, heavier somehow. I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his smile seemed warmer when it was directed my way. Then came the moment that changed everything. I stood to clear the empty beer bottles, and as I turned, my foot caught on the edge of the patio. I stumbled, and Max was on his feet in an instant, catching me by the arm before I could fall. You okay? He asked, his hand firm around my elbow. Yeah, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Thanks. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. His hand lingered on my arm, his thumb brushing against my skin in a way that felt deliberate. My breath hitched, and I saw something in his eyes, an intensity that made my stomach flip. I stepped back quickly, breaking the moment. I should, get dinner started, I said, my words tumbling over each other. Max nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course. I'll see you around, Claire. I watched him walk away, his shoulders tense. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. Nothing had happened, not really, but it felt like everything had changed. That evening, as I cooked dinner, Rob sat at the table scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I tried to act normal, but my mind kept drifting back to Max, to the way he had looked at me, the way his touch had lingered just a moment too long. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of attraction. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Max had awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the tension between us was growing. The morning sun was high in the sky, casting golden light over the neighborhood. It was the kind of day that begged for yard work and time outdoors, and I had decided to tackle the weeds overtaking the flower beds. I just started when Max appeared, carrying a toolbox. Looks like you could use an extra hand, he said, grinning. I think I've got it under control, I replied, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Sure you do, he said, setting the toolbox down by the fence. But I need a reason to avoid unpacking boxes. So let me help. Before I could argue, he was kneeling beside me, pulling weeds with practiced ease. I hesitated but decided to let it go. It was just neighborly, I told myself. We worked side by side, chatting about the best ways to keep pests away from plants and laughing about the quirks of small-town life. His presence was easy, comforting even, but every so often, our hands would brush as we reached for the same weed, or our shoulders would bump as we shifted positions. Each accidental touch sent a spark through me, making it harder to focus. At one point, I reached for a particularly stubborn root, tugging with all my strength. The soil gave way suddenly, and I lost my balance, falling backward. Max's reflexes were quick. He reached out to steady me, his hands gripping my waist. You okay? He asked, his voice low. Yeah, I said, breathless from the fall and the sudden closeness. His hands lingered for a moment before he pulled away, his expression unreadable. I stood quickly, brushing dirt from my jeans, trying to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. Maybe I should take a break, I said, avoiding his gaze. Good idea, he replied, his tone neutral. I walked to the patio, my hands trembling. It was just an accident, I told myself. But the way his hands had felt on me, strong and steady, was anything but forgettable. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Jake begged to set up a sprinkler in the yard. Max and I worked together to connect the hose, our arms brushing as we tightened the fittings. It was such a simple task, but every small touch seemed to carry an unspoken weight. When the boys started running through the water, laughing and shouting, Max and I stood watching from the shade. "They've got the right idea," he said, pulling at the collar of his shirt. "It's scorching out here." "Tell me about it," I said, fanning myself with my hand. Without warning, Max grabbed the garden hose, aiming it at me. A burst of cold water hit my legs, and I shrieked in surprise. "Max!" I shouted, laughing despite myself. "Couldn't resist," he said, his grin wide and boyish. I grabbed the hose, wresting it from his hands, and sprayed him in return. The laughter of the boys echoed as Max and I fought for control of the hose, water splashing everywhere. In the chaos, I slipped, and Max caught me again, his arms wrapping around me to steady my fall. This time, the world seemed to pause. I was pressed against him, his shirt damp and clinging to his chest, his face inches from mine. His breath was warm on my cheek, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "I've got you," he said, his voice soft. "Thanks," I whispered, pulling away. The moment ended as quickly as it had begun, but the tension lingered. I could feel his eyes on me as I turned back to the boys, trying to act as if nothing had happened. That night, as I lay in bed beside Rob, I couldn't stop thinking about Max. The way his hands felt, the way his presence seemed to fill the air around me. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless interactions between neighbors. But deep down, I knew the line between innocent and something more had already begun to blur. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. It started with a text message. I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed on the counter. Wiping my hands on a towel, I picked it up and saw Max's name on the screen. "Max. Hey, I have some extra steaks I don't want to go to waste. Feel like joining me for dinner tonight?" I stared at the message, my heart thudding in my chest. Rob was working late again, and Ethan was spending the night at a friend's house. The thought of being alone with Max felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. But the alternative, another lonely night, was equally unbearable. After a moment's hesitation, I replied, "Sure, what time?" The sun was just beginning to set when I walked over to Max's house. My palms were clammy, and my mind raced with thoughts of how innocent, or not, this was. I'd kept my outfit casual, jeans and a soft blue sweater, but I'd spent far too long choosing it, my reflection scrutinizing every detail. Max greeted me at the door, his smile easy and disarming. He wore a gray t-shirt and jeans, and the smell of something delicious wafted out from behind him. "Perfect timing," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His house was warm and inviting, with unpacked boxes stacked neatly in the corners. The dining table was set simply but thoughtfully, a bottle of red wine already open in the center. "Hope you like your steak medium rare," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "Medium rare is perfect," I replied, following him. We made small talk as he worked, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. He told me about his job in construction, about the places he and Jake had lived before moving here. I found myself sharing more about my own life than I'd intended. How Rob and I had grown distant, how I sometimes felt more like a ghost in my own home than a wife. Max listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. "Sounds like you've been carrying a lot," he said softly. I looked away, embarrassed by how vulnerable I'd been. "I didn't mean to unload on you, Claire," he said, his voice steady. "You deserve to be heard. Don't apologize for that." His words lingered in the air between us, heavy and significant. Dinner was delicious, and the wine flowed a little too easily. By the time we finished, I felt warm and light, my earlier nerves dulled by the easy camaraderie between us. "Dessert?" Max asked, clearing the plates. "I shouldn't," I said, laughing. "Come on," he teased. "You've earned it." I followed him into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he retrieved a small tray of chocolate-covered strawberries from the fridge. "Wow, you went all out," I said, grinning. Figured I should make a good impression, he replied. His tone playful but his eyes serious. He handed me a strawberry, his fingers brushing mine. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hesitated for a moment before taking it. You're good at this, I said, trying to defuse the tension. At what? Making people feel special, I replied, my voice quieter now. He stepped closer, the air between us charged. Maybe that's because you are. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was so close now, his presence overwhelming. My pulse quickened as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Claire, he said, his voice low and intimate. I knew what was about to happen, and I knew I should stop it. But I didn't move. His lips met mine, soft and tentative at first, as if waiting for permission. My resolve crumbled, and I kissed him back, the warmth of his mouth igniting something deep within me. His hands cupped my face, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. Reality crashed back as I pulled away abruptly, my breath ragged. I should go, I stammered, stepping back. Claire, I can't, I said, shaking my head. This isn't right. I grabbed my purse and practically ran out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My lips still tingled from his kiss, and my mind replayed the evening in vivid detail. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew this wasn't the end. Something had begun between us, something that couldn't be undone. The kiss haunted me for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the warmth of Max's lips, the way his hands cradled my face like I was something precious. I threw myself into my routine, desperate to drown out the memory, but it was no use. Max was always there. Next door, in the yard, his smile lingering in my mind long after I'd seen him. And no matter how hard I tried to resist, I felt myself being pulled toward him, helpless against the tide. It was a stormy Friday afternoon when everything changed. Rob was out of town for a work trip, and Ethan was at a sleepover. The rain came down in sheets, rattling the windows and turning the world outside into a blur. I was curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the storm, when the lights flickered and went out. Great, I muttered, setting the book aside. A knock at the door startled me. Heart pounding, I peeked through the window and saw Max standing on my porch, a flashlight in his hand. Power's out, he said when I opened the door. Yeah, I noticed, I replied, shivering as a gust of wind blew past us. You okay? He asked, his eyes scanning my face. I'm fine, I said quickly. Just not a fan of storms. He hesitated for a moment. I've got candles and a generator. Why don't you come over? It's better than sitting here in the dark. I knew I should say no, but the thought of sitting alone in the house, listening to the storm rage outside, was unbearable. Okay, I said, grabbing my coat. Max's house was warm and inviting, the soft glow of candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. He handed me a mug of tea and gestured for me to sit on the couch. Thanks, I said, settling into the cushions. He sat beside me, closer than I expected, and for a moment we sat in silence, the rain pounding against the windows. Storms like this remind me of my childhood, he said finally. Jake's mom and I used to sit like this, just talking until the power came back on. There was a wistfulness in his voice, a sadness that made my chest ache. I'm sorry, I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Don't be. Some things aren't meant to last. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I knew I should say something, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. He didn't pull away. I can't stop thinking about you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Max, tell me to stop, he said, his gaze locked on mine. And I will. I didn't tell him to stop. He closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was anything but tentative. This was hunger, raw and consuming, and I surrendered to it completely. His hands tangled in my hair as I pressed closer, the weight of the world falling away. We moved as if guided by instinct, shedding layers of clothing until there was nothing between us. His skin was warm against mine, his touch electrifying. Every kiss, every caress was a promise, a declaration of something neither of us dared to name. Time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once, the storm outside fading into nothingness. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the candlelight casting soft shadows on his face. I traced a finger along his jawline, marveling at how right this felt, even though I knew it was wrong. "I don't know what we're doing," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Neither do I," he said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "But I don't want it to stop." Neither did I. That night, as I walked back to my house, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and still. My skin still tingled from his touch, and my heart felt impossibly full. But as I climbed into bed, the weight of what I'd done settled over me like a shroud. There was no going back now. The first time was supposed to be the last. I told myself it was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment born of loneliness and longing. But the truth was harder to face. I didn't want it to end. Days turned into weeks, and Max and I found ways to steal moments together. It started with lingering conversations at the fence while the boys played, his hand brushing mine as he passed me a cup of coffee or a tool for the yard. Those touches escalated to secret rendezvous in his house, the blinds drawn, the world shut out. Every time we were together, the weight of guilt pressed harder on my chest, but the pull of him was stronger. One Tuesday afternoon, I found myself standing in Max's kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. The boys were at school and Rob was at work, our usual window of freedom. Max leaned against the counter, watching me with that familiar intensity that always made my pulse race. "You know, you're dangerous," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He smirked, stepping closer. "Dangerous how? You make me forget everything." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Before I could respond, his lips were on mine, the kiss deep and consuming. I melted into him, my hands tangling in his hair as he pulled me closer. Every touch, every kiss felt like a defiance of reality, a stolen moment that existed in its own world. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I don't want to stop, Claire. I don't care what it takes." His words sent a thrill through me, but they also reminded me of the precariousness of our situation. "We have to be careful," I whispered. "We will," he promised, his voice steady. But I wasn't sure if careful was even possible anymore. We settled into a routine of sorts, our lives running parallel during the day and colliding in secret when no one was looking. Max would text me, his messages brief but laced with longing. "Can you come over? I miss you." I'd reply with equal urgency, my heart pounding every time I saw his name on my screen. The stolen moments became a lifeline for me. I lived for the way he made me feel, alive, seen, desired. With Max, I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I was a woman again, vibrant and free. But the double life wasn't without its risks. One afternoon, as I slipped back into my house after a meeting with Max, I froze at the sight of Rob's car in the driveway. My heart raced as I composed myself, forcing a casual smile as I walked inside. "You're home early," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray me. "Got rained out," he replied, glancing up from his phone. "Where were you?" "Just running errands." I lied, my stomach twisting. He didn't press further, but the encounter left me shaken. The closer Max and I grew, the harder it became to keep up the facade. Rob's questions became more pointed, his glances sharper, as if he could sense the distance between us. "You've been distracted lately," he said one evening, his tone casual but his eyes searching. "Just tired," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He didn't push, but the guilt gnawed at me, an ever-present reminder of the line I'd crossed. One Friday, Max and I decided to meet at a park on the edge of town. It was secluded, the perfect place to be together without prying eyes. We sat on a blanket under the shade of a tree, his arm around my shoulders as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you ever think about where this is going?" I asked, my voice soft. He was quiet for a moment before replying. "I think about you, about us, and I don't want to lose this." His words were both comforting and terrifying. I wanted to believe we could keep this up, that we could somehow exist in this secret world without consequence. But deep down, I knew the cracks were already forming. As we kissed under the fading light, I pushed those thoughts aside, choosing instead to lose myself in him, if only for a little while longer. But the more we met, the more risks we took, and the tighter the noose around us became. Every glance, every lingering touch felt like a countdown to something inevitable. And though I didn't know what that something was, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Not yet. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when the first crack in my carefully constructed world began to form. Ethan and Jake were playing in the yard, their laughter floating through the open windows. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when my phone buzzed. "Max, can you come over? I need to see you." I glanced toward the yard, ensuring the boys were still occupied. My heart raced as I typed a quick reply. Give me 10 minutes. I told myself it was reckless, but the need to be with him outweighed the logic screaming in the back of my mind. I slipped out the back door, telling Ethan I needed to grab something from a neighbor. Max was waiting for me in his living room, pacing restlessly. The moment I stepped inside, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine. "I've missed you," he murmured between kisses. "Max," I said, trying to pull away. "The boys are outside. We can't." "They're fine," he insisted, his hands tracing the curve of my waist. His touch made it impossible to think clearly. I melted into him, the world outside disappearing as his hands and lips reminded me why I couldn't stay away. But just as things started to escalate, a sound outside made us freeze. Voices. My stomach dropped as I realized they weren't the boys. "Claire," Max whispered, his voice tight with alarm. We scrambled to compose ourselves, Max straightening his shirt while I fixed my hair. Peeking out the window, I saw them. Sarah and Greg, our neighbors from down the street. They were standing in Max's driveway, chatting and gesturing toward his house. "Why are they here?" I hissed. Max shook his head. "I don't know. They've never just shown up before." The doorbell rang, and my heart felt like it might burst from my chest. "Go out the back," Max whispered. "What if they see me?" He looked torn for a moment, then nodded toward the hallway. "The guest room. Stay there until they leave." I slipped into the guest room, my hands trembling as I pressed my back against the wall. I could hear the muffled sound of Max greeting them, his voice calm and casual. What felt like an eternity later, the door finally closed, and I heard Max's footsteps approaching. He opened the door to the guest room, his expression tight with worry. "They're gone," he said. "What did they want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They were dropping off some flyers for a neighborhood watch meeting," he replied. "Nothing important." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "Claire," Max said, his tone serious. "We have to be more careful." I nodded, my chest still tight with fear. This was a mistake. His eyes softened, and he stepped closer, taking my hands in his. "You don't mean that." I didn't, but the close call stayed with me, a constant reminder of the risks we were taking. That wasn't the only sign that things were spiraling. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. I know what you're doing." I froze, the blood draining from my face. My first instinct was to believe it was a wrong number, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who could it be? Someone who had seen us together? Sarah or Greg? Or worse, Rob? I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message and told myself it was nothing. But the unease lingered, growing with every passing day. The next message came 2 days later. "Unknown number. Meet me at the park, or your husband finds out everything." Panic gripped me as I read the words. My hands trembled as I showed the message to Max. "Someone knows?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Max's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. It's probably someone messing with you. Don't let them scare you. What if it's not? I asked, my voice rising. He didn't have an answer for that. Against my better judgment, I went to the park. It was deserted, the playground empty under the fading light. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. Claire. I spun around, my blood turning to ice. It was Sarah, her arms crossed and her expression cold. Sarah? I stammered. I saw you, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Going in and out of Max's house. I'm not stupid. My knees felt weak, and I struggled to find my voice. I don't know what you're talking about. Save it, she snapped. I've got photos. You'd be surprised how easy it is to catch someone sneaking around when they think no one's watching. My stomach churned as her words sank in. What do you want? Her lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. Money. $5,000, or your husband finds out everything. My world tilted, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I don't have that kind of money. Figure it out, she said, her tone icy. You have a week. When I told Max, he was furious. She's bluffing, he said, pacing the length of his living room. She has photos, Max, I said, my voice breaking. I can't risk it. He stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto mine. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice firm. I won't let her ruin us. But as I lay awake that night, the weight of the situation pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The risks we had taken were catching up to us, and there was no escaping the consequences. The week that followed Sarah's ultimatum was a blur of panic and desperation. I avoided her as much as possible, though her knowing glances whenever we crossed paths were enough to send my stomach into knots. Max and I strategized late into the evenings, whispering furiously in his living room about how to handle her. He insisted we wait her out, convinced she was bluffing, but I wasn't so sure. The deadline loomed over me like a storm cloud. Every interaction with Rob felt like walking on thin ice, each glance and question a potential landmine. I flinched whenever my phone buzzed, terrified of what might be waiting for me. The day of reckoning came on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Rob and I were hosting a neighborhood barbecue, a tradition meant to foster community, though this time it felt more like a trap. Ethan and Jake were running around with the other kids, their laughter mingling with the chatter of adults. I stood by the grill, plastering on a smile as I handed burgers to guests, my heart racing with every passing moment. Max was there, of course. He stood on the other side of the yard, laughing with Greg and another neighbor, but his eyes kept darting to me. I knew he was as on edge as I was, though he hid it well. And then Sarah arrived. She was dressed casually, her smile as bright as the sunshine, but her eyes gleamed with mischief. My chest tightened as she approached Rob, handing him a plate of cookies and striking up a conversation. I tried to stay calm, keeping my distance and praying she wouldn't make a scene. But as the afternoon wore on, I could feel the tension building, a crackling undercurrent that set my nerves on edge. It happened when most of the guests had gathered near the patio, drinks in hand and laughter filling the air. Sarah stood by the refreshments table, her gaze flicking between me and Rob. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. Rob, she said, her tone deceptively casual. Can I ask you something? My heart stopped. Sure, Rob replied, looking up from his drink. Sarah's smile was razor sharp. Do you ever wonder why Claire spends so much time at Max's house? The air seemed to freeze. A hush fell over the group, every eye turning toward us. My mouth went dry, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the table for support. Rob frowned, his confusion evident. What are you talking about? Sarah tilted her head, feigning innocence. Oh, it's probably nothing. I just thought it was interesting how often she's over there, considering how busy you are with work. The color drained from Rob's face as he turned to me, his eyes narrowing. Claire. It's not what you think, I stammered, my voice barely audible. Sarah's smirk widened. You don't have to take my word for it. I have photos. She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen before holding it up for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the images appeared. Pictures of me entering Max's house, leaving hours later, and one damning shot of us standing too close, his hand brushing my arm. The blood roared in my ears as Rob's expression shifted from confusion to fury. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Rob, please. Answer me. Claire!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The truth was written all over my face, and there was no escaping it now. The party disbanded quickly after that. Neighbors mumbled awkward goodbyes, avoiding my gaze as they left. Rob stormed into the house, slamming the door behind him, while Max disappeared without a word. I stood alone in the yard, the remnants of the party scattered around me. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on my chest, threatening to crush me. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, Rob was waiting for me in the kitchen. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice low and cold. I swallowed hard, tears streaming down my face. "It was a mistake." "I'm so sorry, Rob." "A mistake?" he repeated, his laugh bitter. "You call sneaking around with the neighbor a mistake?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," he snapped. "You've done a damn good job of it." He grabbed his car keys and stormed out, leaving me alone in the silence. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the photos Sarah had sent to Rob's phone. Each image was a dagger to my heart, a reminder of how far I'd fallen. The life I'd built, the family I'd cherished, was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The house was unbearably quiet in the days following the revelation. Rob had moved into the guest room, and every interaction between us was cold and clinical. The silence between us was worse than the shouting, each unspoken word a chasm that widened with every passing day. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Ethan's confused glances and hesitant questions only made it worse. "Why is Dad so mad, Mom?" he'd ask, his innocent eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't give. "Sometimes grown-ups have problems," I replied, my voice breaking. "But we love you, Ethan. Never forget that." He nodded slowly, but I could see the worry etched into his young face. I hadn't seen Max since the barbecue. He'd texted once, a simple message. "Are you okay?" I didn't reply. What could I say? That everything was falling apart? That my marriage was in ruins? My life unraveling by the second? But Max wasn't someone who disappeared easily. A week after the blow-up, I found him waiting on my porch when I came home from running errands. "Max," I said, glancing nervously at the driveway to ensure Rob's car wasn't there. "We need to talk," he said, his expression grim. "Not here," I hissed, unlocking the door and motioning for him to come inside. Once we were in the living room, I turned to him, my arms crossed. "What do you want?" "To know what's going on," he said. "You've been shutting me out." "I don't have a choice," I replied, my voice low. "Everything's a mess, Max. Rob knows. Everyone knows." "I know it's bad," he said, stepping closer. "But we can get through this. Together." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You don't get it. There's no together anymore. My marriage is over. My reputation is ruined. And I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm. "Yes, I am," I said, my eyes filling with tears. "This, whatever this is, it's not real, Max. It was an escape, a fantasy. And look where it's gotten me." Max's expression hardened. "Is that all this was to you? A fantasy?" I hesitated, the truth burning in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know anything anymore." His jaw clenched and he took a step back. "I thought we had something real, Claire. Something worth fighting for." "I can't fight anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Then he nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Goodbye, Claire," he said, his voice hollow. And just like that, he was gone. That night, Rob and I sat across from each other in the kitchen, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "I've talked to a lawyer," he said finally, his voice flat. My stomach dropped. "Rob, please. Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Tears spilled down my cheeks, but I nodded, unable to argue. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We figure out how to move forward," he replied. "For Ethan's sake, if nothing else." I nodded again, the weight of his words crushing me. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, tense conversations about custody arrangements, and whispered explanations to Ethan about why his world was changing. Rob was cordial but distant, his walls firmly in place. Couldn't blame him. I had destroyed the trust between us, and there was no coming back from that. As for Max, he was gone. His house sat empty, a for rent sign planted in the front yard. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he and Jake had moved out of state, though I didn't have the courage to find out where. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I picked up a framed photo of our family from the mantel. It was taken years ago, back when Ethan was a toddler and Rob and I were still happy, or at least pretending to be. I ran my fingers over the glass, tears streaming down my face. I had no one to blame but myself. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that seeped into your bones and lingered. I stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing building. It felt like a tomb for the life I once had, every step inside a funeral procession for my marriage. Rob arrived a few minutes later, his face impassive, his posture rigid. He didn't acknowledge me as he walked past, his lawyer by his side. I had my own representation, of course, but it felt like a formality. I was the villain in this story, and everyone knew it. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense, charged with the unspoken animosity between us. Rob's lawyer wasted no time painting me as the unfaithful spouse, presenting the evidence Sarah had so helpfully provided. The photos, the text messages, each piece was a dagger to my heart, a reminder of how far I had fallen. Mrs. Carson betrayed the trust of her husband and disrupted the stability of their family, his lawyer declared, his voice cold and measured. My lawyer argued for leniency, emphasizing my role as Ethan's primary caregiver and my remorse for what had happened. But it was clear where the court's sympathies lay. The moment of truth came when custody was discussed. Rob had filed for sole custody, claiming my actions had shown a lack of judgment that made me unfit to parent full-time. "I've always been there for Ethan," I said, my voice trembling as I addressed the judge. "I made a mistake, an awful, terrible mistake, but my love for my son has never wavered." Rob's gaze was like ice, his jaw clenched tight. "And what kind of example does that set for him?" he asked, his tone laced with bitterness. The judge listened, her expression unreadable. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing down on my chest. When the ruling came, it was a blow I hadn't fully prepared for. Rob was granted primary custody, with me receiving visitation rights. The judge's words were kind but firm. While Mrs. Carson's role as a mother is recognized, the court cannot ignore the disruption her actions have caused to the family dynamic. My breath caught in my throat, tears streaming silently down my face as the words sank in. After the hearing, Rob and I stood outside the courthouse, an awkward silence between us. "I didn't want it to come to this," I said, my voice barely audible. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You didn't leave me much choice, Claire." His words weren't angry, but they carried a finality that cut deeper than any shout ever could. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he added before walking away, leaving me standing there, alone. The days that followed were a blur of packing and goodbyes. The house, once filled with laughter and life, felt like a shell as I gathered my belongings. Rob and I had agreed that Ethan would stay with him in the family home, while I found a small apartment nearby. Ethan tried to be brave, but his tears betrayed him when I explained what was happening. "Why can't we all stay together?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I wish we could," I said, pulling him into a hug. "But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes." and we have to find a way to move forward. I don't want you to go, he whispered, clinging to me. I'm not going anywhere, I promised, though the words felt hollow. Moving day came and went, each box another reminder of the life I was leaving behind. My new apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but it was mine. The first night was the hardest. I sat in the silence, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and let the weight of everything crash over me. The affair, the betrayal, the lies, it had all led to this. I had lost my husband, my family, and the life I'd spent years building. And for what? A fleeting escape from a life I thought was suffocating me? Max was gone. Rob was gone. Even the neighbors who once smiled and waved now avoided my gaze. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to find a fragile sense of peace. Ethan's visits became the highlight of my week, his laughter a balm for my wounded heart. I threw myself into work, into rebuilding my life piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and some days the guilt and regret threatened to consume me. But I held on to the hope that I could find redemption, not in others but in myself. The scars of my choices would always be there, a reminder of the person I never wanted to become again. But they also served as a guide, a promise to myself to be better, to do better, one day at a time. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.